Welcome, everyone. Thank you, QFC, for QCF. That's it, right?
Queer Christian Fellowship.
Yes, thank you for having us here. We are right now at the Brian Eckstein stage at the conference, and we're very excited to start this conversation.
Yeah, hi.
My name's Nadia.
I'm Alba, also known as Reverend Sex.
Uh-huh.
And we both come from Salesforce, and we have some of our Sin VergUenzas in the room today. So it's exciting. This is the first time I've seen some of our people in person. Like, I hugged somebody that I have never met in person before. So I felt like, oh, our people are here.
Yes, this is exciting. It will be a great time.
Find us.
Yes, come. Here, come. Okay, so this is the first time we have like a podcast episode, a TeologIa Sin VergUenza episode in English.
Yes.
And we want to share about the experience making podcast and everything that we are, everything that we do. So for that, we will start with a video. This video is in Spanish. You don't have to, if you don't understand what they're saying, it's okay. We will talk about what it means and everything, but we wanted to share it with you so that you could see a little bit of what we do, what TeologIa Sin VergUenza is about. So
yeah, and like here, we're bringing the voices of the people of TeologIa Sin VergUenza into the room because we get the honor of like hosting, but really it's about amplifying the voices of queer and feminist Latinx folks across the US diaspora and also in Latin America. So even if you don't understand the Spanish, you can feel what we feel like.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll start with that.
Bienvenidos a TeologIa Sin VergUenza, teología queer feminista que hace fluir la justicia.
¿Cuántas personas cristianas conoces tú que viven sin vergüenza como queer y o feministas? Casi no se escucha. Casi no se escucha de nosotros.
I think. It's loading. It is.
It's thinking about it.
Pero sí existimos. Estamos por todo.
I think it might be a loading, no?
Yeah, I think it is. I can try. I think I have it downloaded. Should I do that?
Yeah.
Sorry for the pause, everyone.
Well, while we're doing that, maybe we'll talk a little. I'll talk while you're doing that. How about that?
Yeah.
So TeologIa Sin VergUenza, which translates into English as shameless theology, is basically a project that recognizes, one, that shame and guilt is a lot of what controls the narrative about how we live our full lives as queer people, as people of color, as women-identified people or femme people. And we are working on that project of shame and guilt from a position of Latinx experience and recognizing that just like capitalism understands that borders aren't real, that we in Latino America and the diaspora in the US also recognize that borders aren't real. And so our project, the point, right, is to cross the barriers, both the geographic barriers across nations, across continents, across denominations. We have Sin VergUenzas that come from almost every Christian denomination and lots of non-Christian denominations or faith practices. People who are from the academy, people who are activists, and people who are also pastors, and people who are theologians.
Yes, and we're still loading the video, but we have this map here. So I wanted to ask you, and you've already told us a little bit about that, but how and why was TeologIa Sin VergUenza born? Like, can you tell us a little bit about how that started, how and who by that time you started having those conversations? And we want to hear more about that.
I get the chance to travel and talk to a lot of queer people across Latin America, the US, Eastern Africa. And something that always happens is people go, "You're a Christian and you're a feminist? How is that possible?" and you're queer, that definitely isn't possible. And then when I say I'm a pastor and I deal with sex and sexuality and pleasure and guilt, it's kind of like I can see the steam roll, like lifting from their heads, because it's like, that cannot be possible. Like it isn't. I've been told that as a queer person or as a feminist, I can't also be a Christian. Certainly, I can't respond to a call to faith or a call to mission or a call to pastoral leadership. And I love Latin America, and I've been working really hard as part of the diaspora in the US to rebuild roots to where I come from and the people I come from. And I kept having conversations with people who chose feminism over their faith, but they carried a deep wound about that choice. And a lot of queer people and a lot of trans people who were told there was no place for them in church, there was no place for them to worship God. We talked with someone just last year at the end of the year in Costa Rica who was saying she gets yelled at by her neighbors if they hear her playing Christian music in her house because she is not allowed to worship God, basically. And I get really angry as a queer person, but also as a Christian and as a pastor. And I kept having these conversations where there are these deep wounds about people stealing God and people stealing religion and inflicting deep harm on our community. And I would have these conversations and people would want to talk about the Bible and they want to talk about theology and what did I believe about this, and interrogation for hours, sometimes at a time. But underneath that is a lot of hurt and a lot of pain that I feel really angry about. And so people would say, okay, you believe this, but where do I read more about it? Who else can I hear? What church can I go to? And so our team at Soulforce was like really working hard to find accessible stuff in Spanish in particular. And we have lots of theological booklets that explain about Sodom and Gomorrah and the gender of God and creation, all of this stuff. But when it came to like, how do I understand a liberatory theology? We recognize that fundamentalism has a hold on almost all media. And so we started by saying, me and a friend of mine was like, well, we know other queer feminists who are theologians or pastors or activists. What if we just had some conversations with them? And so that's how it started to be a resource that was an accessible form, not $100 book that nobody could get, not a like deep academic argument about why this interpretation of Leviticus is wrong, but like us having this conversation that somebody could just open and watch. And so that's kind of how it started.
And there's this other thing where, and we will also be having a breakout session later this weekend on Saturday. And there we will talk a little bit more about it. But when some people like us as queer or as feminists, we start looking for feminist or queer theologies, we usually get the English resources. Like when you Google, even if you Google it in Spanish, you will get the English resources. And for me, at least, I thought it was a thing that came from the States. And I didn't know there were people in my country, even though some of the biggest feminist theologians in the world are in Mexico. Yes. I didn't know that. I first met people from the States because of how big the States,
the influence
it has, right?
Totally.
So it is so wonderful to see people speaking Spanish because all these 46 guest theologians speaking Spanish from their perspectives, from their places, from all these countries that we have in green here. It also brings other things besides queer and feminist to the conversation, right? And you can see how in every episode we do talk about queer and feminist theology, but we also talk about imperialism or racism and all of the things that like we come from, like we start knowing that we exist because we know each other, and we make this effort to connect in other intersections. And that has been like, for me as someone that used to watch TeologIa Sin VergUenza, like it was really exciting for me to see that from a place of Latin American or Latin American diaspora.
And so many of our people are like the only one. And so many people write in the chat or in the comments or whatever, and they're like, I didn't know there were other people like me in my country, right? And so that is a big part of it, is like, it isn't just the US that has the handle on like progressive theology, but it is often that there is a queer theologian in that institution or a queer pastor in that church. But to find us together is really hard. And so that was kind of what happened. And it happened exactly like you said, because we would interview someone, and I have to say, like, what it depended on was some really big people initially saying yes. And then once I say, so-and-so referred you, everyone says yes, because that's one of their colleagues or one of their friends. And so it's only been through those kinds of connections of like, so-and-so sent me to ask you to be a part of this. And I think that's what makes TeologIa Sin VergUenza such a strong community, because it's built on relationships that we have. And we're like sharing those relationships with the rest of us so that we also can know those people, which I always just feel like I get giddy every time we have an interview, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to meet this person. We get to have this interesting conversation about ecology and theology, or about like divorce, or I mean, a million things. Yeah. And we don't always agree, but it is wonderful when you center a human and you already take for granted that you have something in common. We always find a way to connect based on knowing that we are each other's people, even if we have very different theology.
Yes. And the other thing we wanted to talk about is this spiritual violence. When TeologIa Sin VergUenza started, one of the things that was a thing in every single episode, wherever the person was coming from, every time there was some sort of conversation about violence and how we experience it. And as Alba was saying, when this community was getting, formed, one of the things that started happening is that I would like us to talk a little bit more about that. We started thinking, how can we expand the conversation about spiritual violence? So the first thing that happened is that you guys started this set of conversations with people, and you made like this invitation on Facebook for spiritual violence survivors.
Yeah.
And I was there as a survivor back then, and I was a part of the conversations. And I think we would like to hear more about how this started from this set of like conversations, online Zoom meetings, and it came to like, then we created the Centro de Estudios, or the Spiritual Violence Institute. But I would like to know more about that expansion and how it was for you, where it came from.
Yeah. So like Soul Force is celebrating our 25th year this year. So yay for Soul Force. A quarter century is a long time in queer movement space. And 25 years ago, Mel White, who was one of our founders, he had this whole campaign around stopping spiritual violence. And in that moment, it meant more about like inclusion in church spaces and in Christian college spaces. And now it's come to be a much broader concept that we use to talk about any time that someone's sacred worth is called into question or taken away from someone because of their identities, whatever it is, whether it's like you're a woman and therefore you aren't supposed to do XYZ things, or whether it's like you're queer and therefore you are fill in these blank words that we all know. It's about undermining the inherent dignity and worth. And that's been true. We have these really funny stickers from 25 years ago, these big red stop signs, and they're like as big as my hand. And they just say, stop spiritual violence, like stop. And it always makes me think of like the song, like stop in the name of love, like, which would be a great theme song. Yeah. But the idea of like stop spiritual violence is around recognizing that using the name of God and the word of God to back up a position that like leads people to dislike, question, hurt, hate anyone is violence. And a lot of times naming it does part of the healing work. And so that's what happened when we started doing TeologIa Sin VergUenza. one of the central things that happens is this violence at some point that tells us we're not allowed to worship, we're not allowed to be a part of God's community, we're not allowed to have spirituality. Or if we are allowed, we come, but we have to keep our head down. God forbid we hold the hand of someone we love, those kinds of messages. And that understanding that when we name something, we feel less alone because now we're part of a group of people. It feels similarly to when I got words like xenophobia or racism or classism or sexism or all these isms, right? That now we understand come from structures that isn't about like, that person said something mean to me, but rather is a example of a bigger idea that's meant to keep certain people in power and keep the rest of us out of power. And so these conversations started because we had all this time, all these conversations with folks, and then there was conversations in the chat, but this was the first time that we were opening up our community to say, if this resonates with you, come be part of the conversation and let's work on the process of thinking through and healing together, because it wasn't like, here's a therapeutic session and we're going to tell you what you need to do. It was more like, here's some information. And then we break up into small groups and just share like what came up for you, what happened in your life, what's going on for you at this moment, what, resonated basically.
And I think that's good that you mentioned it. Like 25 years ago, you knew like Mel White and everyone around, like the people that were organizing back then, we knew like they knew that was violence, like spiritual violence, and they knew there was something about it that was so destructive but then it's good to see how the concept has been growing and how that has been like how it comes, like people talk about it and being able, as you said, to name it. It's also a way to start reclaiming and understanding our story in a different way and in a different light. And I would like for us to talk a little bit about how spiritual violence looks like in Latin American audiences, because once we started like with the podcast TeologIa Sin VergUenza and with these spaces, there are some nuances that only people in Latin America, I think, like.
Tell us about it.
Okay, no, I just think, well, yes, these first conversations then ended up in the Centro de Estudios, the Spiritual Violence Institute.
And people came from like, I think we had 14 countries represented in those first set of conversations, which is phenomenal in my mind to be like, yes, you're coming from one of 14 countries, and yet we can all sit in the same room and have the same conversation about the same phenomena that shows up differently in each person's context, but yet is similar enough that we find community around it.
Yes, and also this interdisciplinary approach that has been, the spiritual balance has been led by yourself as a theologian, Karina, which is also a theologian, but she has psychology studies and all these other places where people come from and how they analyze and talk about like spiritual violence as a concept, and like social sciences, and
totally
that also nurtures a lot, I think, the conversation.
Wait, we're going to go back to what are the nuances?
Yeah,
some of the nuances. You're going. Okay, great.
We're going there.
Okay, great.
And for that, I think we should talk about the spiritual violence book, because all that work, like we wanted to share with you how those first conversations ended up in a book that is now available in Spanish and soon in English, and that is called Violencia Espiritual y Fenómenos Religiosos que Abusan de la Fe, Spiritual Violence and Religious Phenomena that Abuse Faith.
Yes.
And in that book, I think one of the greatest things about that book and that we are so proud of is it explores spiritual violence in these different levels, right? Like it talks about spiritual violence, like how it works in your body, but it also talks about spiritual violence in Latin America, how we cannot separate ourselves in this continent. We cannot like separate Christianity from the violence that it carries, like the historical colonization won't. So it is I think it's a very interesting and valuable way to understand the things that we feel in our bodies and understand it's not just us, but it carries a history with it, right?
And that there's like how many of our conversations start with the US or at least English as the like locus of where the conversation begins, and then it gets adapted to like Latin American context. But the strategies of colonization were very different when the Spanish and the Portuguese are conquering as compared to like the English, right? And so one of the things that feels really important to me is that this book was written by us with like from a Latin American perspective toward a Latin American audience. And it feels like once we get in English, but even those of us in the US who speak Spanish, we get to look into what is true about our ancestors, what's true about our families. And it isn't like adapted from a US centric form. It's actually centered and grounded in Latin America. And for me, that makes all the difference, because as someone who's adapting the book to English, it's an entirely different context. And so I feel like it's really interesting and wonderful, and exactly how it should be, that we as TeologIa Sin VergUenza are serious about putting leadership and like the center of the conversation in Latin America and adding the diaspora into that rather than centering the US. I think it's part of our model and our methodology for Soulforce, and it absolutely is center to the conversation about TeologIa Sin VergUenza, and in this case in Spanish.
Yes, and yes, talking about these nuances that come from talking about spiritual violence with Latin American audiences, I was thinking we had the opportunity to take this content from the book into a course with Vanderbilt Divinity School. It was a free online course, and when we were having the sessions with the people from different countries in Latin America, I remember this one time that we were talking about how spiritual violence is a systematic thing in Latin America and how it carries like this colonization wound. And I remember we had someone from Guatemala and I think Nicaragua, and they made the connection so quickly from their governments and how spiritual violence, even though they don't like, even though a politician is not using, sometimes they are using the name of God, but even if they are not using it, how they are carrying Christian supremacy, and they are using Christian supremacy binaries and moral codes, and the way they took what we were saying and so deeply translated it to their own experiences. It's something that I don't think I've seen happening with US audiences. Like it usually starts like when you talk about spiritual violence with someone, it's usually you go from your body and your own experience and then start looking at the structural thing. But when you are talking to a Latin American, well, not every time, but sometimes when you talk to Latin American audiences, it's easier for them to see the structurality, like the history, and to see it in the governments and to see it in what we were saying about imperialism and the way media works and how we get some discourse and narratives easier from the States. Those things I think are easier to understand. Not easier, but they make sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think the thing I want to say about that also is like, I think in the US, sometimes people are like, but how could you attack Christianity? How could you attack Jesus? And I think what I see in Latin America is that so many of us are really deeply rooted in the faith, that people don't have they don't feel the same tenderness around your attacking religion. Because I mean, I'm a pastor, and part of the reason I do this is because I'm like, that isn't God, that's power, right? That's a different thing altogether. And I feel mad, frustrated, angry, and convicted that God has been stolen to be used in this harmful way. And so being able to see the structure of it, I think, is really key to being able to separate that which is faith and God and the divine and the voice of God from what we are told we are bad or should have shame or guilt around. And I think that there is something to be said around us trying to find our audience in the US and in English-speaking audiences, because part of this work for many of us, not for all of us, but for many of us, it's because of our faith that we are driven to question, why were we told this thing? Is this what God thinks about us in our lives? Or is this what was imposed by a colonial or imperialist framework? And therefore, where is the voice of God? Where is the possibility of faith in my life as a queer person, where my whole self and my most abundant life gets to take place?
Yes. And yes, I was thinking in Soul Force, we talk a lot about Christian supremacy and white Christian supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I have here the definition that we usually use, right? And I think in the US, it's important, and I've seen you that whenever we talked about it, you always do this, like Christian supremacy is not Christianity. It robes, like it takes the language, and it takes, like, we have to make that distinction. And it's interesting because I think in Latin America, a lot of people are familiar with those spaces of contradiction, right? Like it's easier for someone to understand that something they believe so dearly and it's so important in their faith can be used against them. Like you don't have to like make that distinction. So like be so intentional about making like, it is not Christianity. You don't have to defend Christianity or trying to make like a
caveat.
Yeah, like you don't have to make that case for like to explain that Christianity can be both healing and can be yours and can define yourself, and then it can also be used against you.
Why do you think that is? I
think we've seen it. We've seen it being used in our history, right? And we've seen it like even in our families. Like, you know, you can love God so deeply and then be told that God doesn't love you. And it's something that carries, like, I've heard my grandma talk about how she wasn't allowed sometimes to get into the church or whatever, like, or you've seen people from like missionary type, like people from the States coming, and you can see that distance between yourself and the person that they tell you is the representative of God. So I think you can understand those nuances easier. Maybe I'm thinking out loud.
Yeah, I think that's also true. I don't know that I've had a single conversation with a Black person in the United States who, when I say white Christian supremacy, don't immediately understand what I'm talking about. So I wonder also if it depends on what our like context and location are, because if we understand deeply something like white supremacy, then understanding how Christianity goes with it kind of clicks. And I think the other side of that, though, is that some of us fight so hard to keep our Christianity or keep our God or keep our spirituality that we feel really defensive about people coming after it, because so often, at least in my experience, if you're an activist, you can't be a Christian. If you're a Christian, you shouldn't be an activist. And there's this, because we've seen religion used against some of our like human rights struggles, there's this same binary we're trying to destroy around gender, around sexuality, around it's either this or that. I think we get that same thing around like, you are either Christian, which means you need to toe the line on each one of these topics, or you are not Christian, and therefore you don't get to or deserve these other spiritualities. And I think part of what I hope we're doing in Soul Force and in TeologIa Sin VergUenza is teasing out that isn't true either. That same binary of you either like accept every single thing or you're not Christian. Or if you have a critical analysis or a critique or do activism on human rights, then you can't be a Christian, because we are living examples of how faith actually drives our activism and makes us rigorous in our analysis, because we know not all of us, again, are people of faith. But as a queer feminist pastor, Christian pastor, it is my faith that drives me to both critique anything that doesn't fall in line with God's plan of life abundant for all of us.
Yes. And I think that is a very common experience that I think that will resonate to a lot of people that are here at QCF. Yes, I always get that wrong, and I did QFC, but no, QCF.
If it were in Spanish, it would be the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, like this thing where whenever we talk to people, these 46 guest theologians that we've had in TSB, like these are people that come from academic backgrounds, or they are pastors, or they have been doing all these things. And they like this feeling like, you cannot tell me I don't love God. And there's this thing where whenever you're a queer person in church, they will tell you your faith was never like big enough, or you weren't really a Christian to start.
Or you're not being obedient.
Yeah. And it's like this feeling like, I know I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important for me, right? Yeah. And you see all these people that have had such a hard experience in theology spaces or academia, or like reading the Bible and confronting the Bible, and then be like, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't important to me. Like, I shouldn't be here. Like, I shouldn't have to take all of this that people are telling me, right? So this is this experience of having to defend yourself and explaining, and that is, I think it's a very common experience sometimes.
And I think that's why people keep coming back. One of the biggest surprises for me was like, we would have a guest theologian, and so many of their peers, other academicians or other pastors or other activists, would show up in the comments and would be like, yeah, that's my friend, or like, that's my peer. Or, sometimes it's an academic conversation and they're quoting all of these theologians or thinkers or theorists that I don't even know. And they're having a conversation with their peers, but they return week after week. And I think it's exactly what you just said, of like a shared common experience of somebody saying, I also fought to keep my faith. I also fought to respond in my own way, whether it's within or outside Christianity, to what I've been told I'm not allowed to or doesn't belong to me. And seeing each other, even if it's like across many countries, across multiple continents, seeing other people tell their stories feels like, oh, me too. It's like this feeling of not being alone. And I think one other part I want to talk about in this is like part of what Christian supremacy and capitalism and imperialism, all of those tell us, is that we have to have like a resume a mile long for why we deserve to be listened to. And even then, what they often want to listen to is like, you're an expert on X thing. Let's talk about X thing. And TeologIa Sin VergUenza comes at it from a different place. It's like, if you have ever been shamed for who you are or what you believe, or like any of your identities, then you are part of our community unless you opt out. But like, we assume that we will find things in common. And therefore, we want to know about you as a whole human. And so sometimes it's happened before where I invite someone who is like an expert on, I don't know, let's say like the prophets in the Old Testament. And we wind up having a conversation about divorce, because what's on their heart at that moment is that they've gone through a divorce recently, and they're like wrestling with the question of what God thinks about divorce, or what theology says about their goodness or their ability to be in church. And it's like, if that's what's on top and that's what's in your heart, then that's the conversation we want to have in the space, which means we talk about all kinds of things. Sometimes we have a plan of like, we'll talk about this. And then we get on the show and the conversation moves and the spirit moves in a different direction. And we go with that. And it is some of the most alive conversation, because we actually want to know about you. And not one time has it happened where we haven't gotten to the end and I'm like, man, I had 3 more questions that I really wanted to ask about this other thing, which was why they got invited on the show to begin with. And we didn't hardly even touch that. Or sometimes we don't touch it at all. And it's like, well, isn't that amazing that the spirit moved in the conversation? What was alive took us in a different direction. And we were willing to follow that vibe, follow that energy.
Yes. And also we've had this talk before about how sometimes as queer Christians, we are so used to defend our existence all the time. So we talk about Arsenokai over and over again. And we know these words and we know these verses, and it's so frustrating because we are more than that. And queer theology is more than just explaining yourself all over again. And like letting people know you are able to exist. And once we, I think one thing that makes TeologIa Sin VergUenza such a safe space for people to share those things is because we start from, we know queer people of faith exist everywhere. And the intro that you weren't able to see because of the video thing, but the video, that intro says, we are here, we are a lot of it, we know we exist. So leaving that aside, who are you? And being able to put that aside, and yes, we can talk Bible, and yes, we can defend ourselves, but we are more than that. And we see God, and we create, and our theology goes beyond that, right? And that thing, I think it's something that we sometimes fall, as queer Christians, we fall into that binary, and it makes sense, right? That we have been questioned so much during our lives that we feel the need of presenting ourselves. But once you put that outside, there are so many things that people do at TeologIa Sin VergUenza, and so much richness in theology that goes beyond that, right?
And so many intersections, like you were saying, I find that always interesting, where someone is an eco-feminist theologian. So they care a lot about creation and the earth and the degradation of the earth and the abuse of earth. Mm-hmm. And, we've had indigenous scholars. And so they're talking about their connection to the land and their people's connection to the land. And they have been told, you don't get to be a Christian theologian because you have indigenous spirituality also. And yet all of us who practice Christianity practice some form of integration and synchronization between indigenous theologies, indigenous practices, and Christianity, because that's how it moved as empire moved. And so when we start from that place, it's just a different conversation. And what I find, for me at least, sometimes people are I loved what you said about this or that other thing. And I feel this moment of because I was having a conversation with somebody that I was interested in talking to or cared about or wanted to know about. And I share really personal things. And I think that happens to all of us because we feel safe in the conversation. And oftentimes we forget that there are thousands of people that are watching and listening to that conversation. And all of a sudden we've shared things that are deeply personal, but it's those things that are actually personal that resonate with other humans' experiences, as opposed to the technical definition of this and that other thing, or what the Bible says, da, 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 da. It gets actually about humans, and we connect with each other from that heart space.
Yes. The other thing that, just to contextualize what you were saying, TeologIa Sin VergUenza is a live podcast.
Yes.
So that's something that makes it, I think, dynamic, maybe, because we kind of prepare, you all prepare a little bit about, you have another conversation previous to the live recording, but being able to see the comments and talk to people. And it used to be on Sundays, right? Sunday morning, where people usually go to church, and people have told us that is church for them, right? So being able to see a comment and then respond to that comment, and that makes the conversation go somewhere else. I think that's a type of conversation dialogue that we sometimes are not used to. And that makes it's great to see these great theologians from these universities being able to listen to a comment, read a comment, and then share an experience. And it feels it nurtures that connection, I think, right?
Yeah, it's really real. And sometimes it's ooh, hi, everyone out there, because we get deep in the conversation. But it really is it's toward trust and toward vulnerability, saying we're trusting that we're going to be in this thing together. And that we're not going to try to set you up or make you look stupid or be well, why do you think that, whatever. And that kind of trust feels like such a gift that we are offered, by folks who are willing to come on a live show to talk about really things that are really important to them. Sometimes they're more personal, sometimes they're more academic, but what a gift of vulnerability and honesty from people who all of us at some point have been told we don't deserve to be in that conversation and seen as whole beings.
And it's very brave because how and we will talk more about it in our breakout session.
Yes.
So stay tuned for that on Saturday. But the way Christian supremacy and religious fundamentalism works in Latin America, it's very big on social media, and it does have a very hostile way in the States too, but the way it works in Latin America, and it kind of relates to shame and shaming and doxing people. So talking about those things in Spanish, online, live, it is a brave thing to do, right? Yeah. And it's not we cannot, even though we do, we have these safety measures and we want to create the safest space, we cannot assure that we won't be attacked, right?
Right. And people risk a lot. We've had people come out for the first time as queer publicly on the podcast, meaning this is the first time that they have ever publicly said, I identify as, and that is a incredibly brave thing to do. We've had other people who risk their jobs because if they come out as affirming, even if they themselves are not LGBT, but if they come out publicly and say, I am part of this queer feminist podcast, and I'm going to be talking about religion and theology, professors at universities who put their jobs on the line to be able to have a conversation with us and put their feet on the side of our cause, because TeologIa Sin VergUenza isn't just a space for community. It's also meant to respaldar. What is that word? To provide backup for activists who are saying, we deserve equal rights, we deserve treatment, we deserve not to have violence committed against us in the form of discriminatory laws or culturally. And that purpose we take really seriously. And so we also invite people who are allies to come and be a part of the conversation from their theological perspective. And those people also risk a lot. Like I was just saying, this university professor in Peru who risked her job to be able to come. It forces people to take a position. And when people say yes to be a part of TeologIa Sin VergUenza, they are publicly saying, I support this community or I'm part of this community. And that is incredibly risky in Latin America for a lot of us.
Yes, or activists, right?
Yes.
We have a lot of friends, sinvergüenzas, who are activists in contexts that sometimes we don't understand how important and how the stakes for being an activist in their countries talking about these things.
Can I tell you a story about Honduras?
Yes.
I tell our people.
Yes.
One of our brilliant, amazing sinvergüenzas is a pastor, Ruth Carcamo, and she came on TeologIa Sin VergUenza. And it was an amazing episode. She was talking about where there are spaces for queer people within the reproductive justice movement, about things like child rape and incest, 12-year-olds getting pregnant and being forced to have children, and all of the criminalization that happens, particularly in Honduras. And her story about having to go into hiding because of her activism as a pastor, and her choice to stay in her country and not be in exile, and what dangers came with that. It was an incredibly meaningful and powerful conversation. And when we got done with the episode, I talked to her the next day, and she was saying I think something's wrong because I can't see it on Facebook, it's live on Facebook. So it's recorded on Facebook. So we quickly got it up on YouTube, which is where kind of our library is. And we're okay, it's up on YouTube. You can check it out there, because she's trying to share it with her community. And the next day she's I can't see it on YouTube either. We can see it on our side in the US, and she can't see it on any of those platforms. And what we learned in the days that followed, as we figured out how to compress it and send it over WhatsApp so that it could be sent in personal messages, what we learned is that the government had blocked the page so that nobody in Honduras could see that episode, both on YouTube and on Facebook, something I didn't even know was possible. But that quickly, within hours of her doing this show, that the government could shut it down and block it on multiple platforms over the course of days, tells you how potent, how meaningful, how necessary, and what she risked by being on the show, and the fact that she was willing to be there, to be a part of that, to add the voice of what was happening to queer people and women identified people in Honduras. It's a big deal. And that was a huge risk. And that was the first time I'd ever had the experience of such a direct, force coming down on one of our episodes. And it was a really important moment to recognize what people risk when they come on our show.
Yes, and what Christian supremacy is about, right?
Yeah.
Like, we know in theory how those systems, systems of power work, but it's different when you see it in practice, like with governments, with activists, with their narratives that are like the relationship governments have to some churches in Latin American countries, in Latin American media. Like, that's where you can see the practice of those things we talk about and we've been talking about for 25 years, right? Okay, so we have some minutes left, like 7 minutes left, and I don't think we have questions online. If you are watching us online and you want to make a question or a comment, feel free to do so. And also,
now is your moment.
Now's your moment, yes. And also, if someone here wants to make some comments or like final questions, you can.
Okay. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking.
We can, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you want to say something else about before we?
Well, I think some of the questions that come up for me that I would ask our audience, both people who are watching, people who will watch when the recorded session goes out, people in the room, is like, where are the moments in your life where you were made to feel shame about who you were or what you did? And when those moments happen, how did that moment of shame change the direction or the path of your faith, right? And so I think that's really important, because many of us have a moment where we were like, oh, this thing I feel or do or think about is bad, and how that limits what is possible in our lives, or how intense the break has to be for us to hear the voice of God that is saying yes from within, is so much harder. And I think that question of like, when in my life has shame that I thought or was told was the voice of God actually not been God? And what do I do with that now that I know that it's possible for that not to be, like, to interrogate, is that the voice of God or is that the voice of a power? Even if that power comes through the voice of my mother or my pastor or my aunt or whatever. I think that those, like, we talk a lot about theory and academia, we talk about all kinds of stuff, but at the core of it is people's hearts and souls, and the moment in which shame silences us, and what we, as people who fight against that shame, do, whether it's within the institution of church or the academy or the institution of Christianity or not.
Yes. And also how that translates to the way we build community. And yes, like we had this, to end our conversation, we wanted to share some pictures of the work we've done and how that live spaces and online spaces have also translated into in-person community building, and also workshops, and also like, like these spaces of encountering and listening to each other, right? And yes, I don't know if you want to say something else about that, but I think these are some of the things or places we've been a part of, different countries, Costa Rica, Argentina, Cuba, and all these people, like all these communities that have felt called, like feel that what we say about Christian supremacy or spiritual violence resonate with them.
Mhm.
Are different people from different backgrounds, and we have like people that take these teachings about Christian supremacy, translate it to their activism with youth, and
Mhm.
there's people that talk about sexual workers or LGBT churches, but there's also feminist groups that work with people that were victims of religious abuse. So it's interesting to see how that work translates into a lot of conversations and actions. And yeah, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just leave it there. I think you're right? Like spiritual violence is something that impacts all of us all the time because we live in cultures where shame is used as a mechanism of control. Regardless of whether you're queer or a woman or whatever, somebody has told you basically you shouldn't do that. Shame on you, in so many words. And therefore, once we start seeing where that strategy is used, we can then discern for ourselves where is my moral compass and my moral guide. I think what I want to use the last few minutes for, and if somebody has a question or comment, raise your hand and we'll pause. Go ahead. I just want to give a promo about our next season and all that stuff.
Hello.
Hi.
That's louder than I thought I was going to be. My family is from the Dominican Republic, and they immigrated here in like the 60s. I was raised by my grandmother who grew up like in the mountains, and is conservative Christian. When I came out to her as queer, she in turn came out to me. That moment was beautiful, but she still has so much internalized queer phobia, and so much of the spiritual violence that I have experienced has been from her. And so I guess I'm curious to hear about what it's been like if you have worked with queer elders in Latin America, and how to help them heal. Because I think for younger folks, it's easier for us to find community and to access the means and language for healing. But for her, it's obviously much harder to do that.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about that as one of the boundaries or the fronteras. Like one of the ways that we're crossing is around intergenerational. We were looking on Facebook, I guess it was last year, and a quarter of our following are women over 60. And it's like, what? Like, that was so shocking to me because we're like radicals, over here talking about God loves queer people and, non-monogamy and pleasure and abortion. We're talking about like, we just, all the taboo stuff, we're like, whatever it is, bring it to the table and we'll have a conversation, even if we don't agree. Like, and what I have found at least, is that there is a group of women, particularly, occasionally there's a man here or there of that generation, but mostly it's women who have spent their lives checking the boxes of what it meant to be a good person. And there's this moment that seems to happen for a lot of the people who follow us, where they have checked off all the things. They've been married, they've had their children, they've worked in the church. And then they get to a moment where they're like, I've done all the things I was supposed to, and now I want to know the truth. And there's this like these questions that bubble up. Sometimes it's about queerness, sometimes it isn't about queerness. But there's this like curiosity that and this permission that they've given themselves after completing all that society said they were supposed to do. And so we have found a lot of elders actually come into the space because they're like, sometimes I don't understand what y'all young people are talking about with your pronouns. And I'm sorry if I'm getting this right, but y'all are just like made in the image of God. And that's just all I know. It's like for us, for people of our generation and younger, we would be like, you have to get my pronouns right. That's so disrespectful. And we recognize that for an 80-year-old woman, for her to say, I'm sorry if I don't understand what y'all are talking about, I'm just going to sit in God thinks that you're made in the image and God loves you. Like, we'll take it. And it gives us hope. And it gives us, for a lot of us, it gives us like a possible imaginary of what it could be like if our parents accepted us, or our families, or our grandparents, or whatever. And so we had one person, like I would encourage you, for example, to listen to our episode where we had a Catholic grandmother.
Rosa Manriquez, right?
Yes, it's Rosa Manriquez. And Rosa Manriquez talks about the blessing of her being the mother of two queer daughters, and what it meant for her coming out of a marriage in which her husband came out as queer and left them, and all of the reconciliation she had to do with him that she did, that then translated into, when her daughters came out, her being able to recognize that as a blessing, even though she had been hurt by that very understanding it as a system rather than a person. And so I'm biased, but I think that there's an episode of TeologIa Sin VergUenza. We try really hard to have episodes of TeologIa Sin VergUenza for almost every question that someone has, including folks who are coming out at very late stages. And understanding spiritual violence, I think, is one of the critical ways to understand that even when people who love us are perpetrators of spiritual violence and harm, that can happen even when it's coming from a place of love. And how many of us know that the pastors who are the most vocal about anti-LGBT people often are the ones who show up in scandals with some sort of same-sex relationship? Like, so we recognize that there is a deep wound that comes from that need to criminalize and demonize. And so we find a lot of those folks. So
yes. And I think we don't have any more. Oh, you have okay.
Yes, it looks like there is one question on the chat, if I could ask it. Laura from North Carolina said, this is such a good conversation. Where can I hear it again online afterward?
Wonderful question. So TeologIa Sin VergUenza right now is in Spanish. If you speak Spanish, or if you're learning Spanish, what a great place. Like, sometimes with the theology stuff, it's close enough to English that's like, if you're learning Spanish, you're like, I recognize that word. We actually have an episode in which we're speaking in Spanish to someone who speaks Portuguese back to us. And so it's a very interesting conversation of like us trying to understand the Portuguese and her speaking back to us and her understanding us in Spanish. So, we're just crossing all the lines of difference to try to find our community. But this year, we will not only have the adaptation of the spiritual violence book in English, but we will be having some of our TeologIa Sin VergUenza episodes in English, because we recognize that Latinx people are not just Spanish speakers. We are also Portuguese speakers, and there are many of us who don't speak Spanish. And we also want to say to all of you, you are also part of our shameless theology community. And so you can find us at @TeoSinVergUenza on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us from the soulforce.org website. We want you in our spaces. We hope to do another round of the Vanderbilt Divinity School course in Spanish. And hopefully this year, also a round of that same course in English, which is a 5-week module that is free.
Yes. And well, I think we're done, but the video is now loaded. So
maybe
if
we
you
can
want,
end with the video.
we can end with that. So thank you for that video.
And thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. So we can start with that.
Bienvenidos a Teología Sin Vergüenza, teología queer feminista que hace fluir la justicia.
¿Cuántas personas cristianas conoces tú que viven sin vergüenza como queer y o feminista? Casi no se escucha de nosotros, pero sí existimos. Estamos por todas partes, luchando en la academia, en las iglesias, en las casas y en las calles. Luchamos por nuestras comunidades y por nuestras propias vidas. No somos machos, pero somos muchas.
Somos queer feministas sin vergüenza de tener fe. Somos teólogos sin vergüenza de ser activistas. Somos las sinvergüenzas. Le sacamos el jugo a la Biblia para producir teología queer feminista que refresque la lucha y haga venir la justicia.
En cada episodio encontrarás teología bien jugosa, como agua de papaya.
Chúpetela.
Hola Alba, ¿cómo estás hoy?
Hola, Liz.
Nos encontramos con la reverenda Rina Ramos.
Gracias, qué bienvenida. Yo quiero agua de papaya.
Y Margarita, ¿dónde estás?
Yo estoy en Ciudad de México.
Mi nombre es Eddie Rosas y estoy aquí también en Chicago.
Karina desde San José, Costa Rica. Hola, yo soy Marilu Rojas y estoy en la Ciudad de México.
Agustina Lubis Núñez, acá en Puerto Rico.
Ángel Francisco Méndez Montoya, yo estoy en Cuernavaca, Morelos.
Yo soy André y estoy en algún lugar en Brasil.
Ana Ruth García, desde Honduras.
Eu sou reverenda Ana Esther, sou de Brasil, Belo Horizonte, y actualmente yo moro no estado do Missouri.
Hola, hola a todo el mundo. Yo soy Yolanda Santiago Correa, estoy en Austin, Texas, pero soy de Puerto Rico, de Bayamón, Puerto Rico.
Total y orgullosamente sin vergüenza.
Yo estoy convencida que el arquetipo de la diosa todavía circula en América Latina.
El acto más revolucionario que una persona puede hacer es amarse a sí misma. Porque en una sociedad que te enseña a odiarte por ser diferente, que te discrimina, te excluye, el amor es la respuesta.
El tema y la médula del asunto es: hay que taladrar el sistema, hay que derribar el sistema, hay que horadar el sistema.
Yay!
Come to our session on Saturday.
Yes, and thank you for being here.
Yeah. And come say hi when you see us. It's our first time at the conference. So we're like, where are people? Hi, everybody.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yay. Bye-bye.